I am very excited to be here today to talk to you about trauma, and maybe from a little slightly different lens from what you've heard before, and maybe not. So please forgive me if I am, so to speak, preaching to the choir. And at the same time, this is really some important information to get out there. And I absolutely welcome all of your questions, reactions, agreements, or disagreements. All is welcome. So we are going to start today to explore this question of, is this trauma trend a myth? And the reason why I titled the presentation this way is because there seems to be, amongst lots of other themes of polarization in our culture right now, a lot of polarization around, trauma is becoming a word that is constantly referenced and used. And yet, I'm not sure if it's being used in a way that reflects what we understand about it from a scientific perspective. And what that means is oftentimes people add to what they hear in a snippet, their own personal experiences, their experiences of working with loved ones who are struggling, working with clients who are struggling. And a lot of times, it gets into that little mix, it gets jumbled up, and we start to even kind of go, okay, so we have a new word, trauma. What's the big deal? And what is this really all about? And is that even legitimate? Is it just an excuse, etc.? So we're going to dive in deep to talk about that. Before we start, I just would love to please feel free to type into chat. What is your understanding about what trauma is? And, there's some pretty standard answers. Those are welcome. But anything that comes to mind is what I'm looking for. And you might even pause and just to consider before you're responding, what isn't trauma, right? With this new trend and referencing of trauma, what wouldn't be trauma? So go ahead and put into chat what you understand trauma is. Someone's got to go first. You can do it. Life-changing, life-altering, feels like your life is in danger, a loss of connection, absolutely, absolutely, an injury, excellent, that can definitely be traumatic, a separation of connection with self or others, any event that causes harm. Yeah, okay, thank you. This is what it's really helpful for me to kind of get a sense of, who we are collectively in this moment for training, to be able to respond in a way that is on point and around your questions and concerns. So literally everything that was referenced in the chat about what trauma is, and I think I saw right there at the end, there was one reference about what isn't trauma, and it was sort of referenced resiliency and being able to kind of rise above. So let's talk about what trauma is, and we're going to talk about this from just a slightly different perspective than perhaps you've heard before. So first of all, when I referenced this trend of trauma, these were some of the things that I have heard out there, and I want to do it. Sorry, I forgot to do any kind of introduction. My name is Tamara Ford. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I was born and raised in Michigan originally. I am now in the Denver metro area, seeking solace in a rural community at this point. And so I've had the opportunity to work in hospitals, I've worked in schools, I've worked in residential treatment, I've worked in day treatment, and now I currently am running a private practice that is focused on trauma resolution. So in all of those different contexts, I've had the opportunity to hear a lot of people's references about trauma. And these are some of the things that I've heard. It seems like everyone claims trauma as an excuse for poor behavior or their own poor decisions. Why can some people experience trauma and do just fine, but others can't? Doesn't that mean essentially that some people are weak? right? Or that they can't pull it together. So if someone has experienced trauma, everyone else is supposed to accommodate them. Like, where does it end, right? And lastly, is society as a whole responsible for an individual's trauma? My point here is that these are kind of references that even those of us who are providing services and care and support, even in our best of intentions, trauma is heavy, and trauma is a challenge to really understand how it works. And so when we feel our own frustration, these are some of the references or questions, reactions that we all can begin to, feel at some point. So I just want to point out that if we look and note sort of some of this polarization, the trends of society, and we add to that some level of misinformation, not intentional, but just not really getting some of the scientific understanding, this is ripe for developing even continued stigma. So trends with some misinformation, it really creates more stigma. And when we're talking about trauma, my intent and objective today is to help you have a lens and understanding of what trauma is that will help us depersonalize and be able to learn some of the strategies that we need to all begin to have in our toolbox, so that our reactivity and our own trauma sphere bumping up against somebody else's trauma sphere doesn't create effectively more trauma, right? Perhaps there's a nature of humanity in there. Maybe we're salmon swimming upstream, but I absolutely believe in getting the information out as much as possible and helping to attach that information to really concrete strategies. So moving forward, let's define trauma. It used to be, according to the DSM, trauma was defined by experiencing or witnessing a life or death threatening situation. Okay, so what that would reference is like a very big car accident, being held up, at gunpoint, something like a kidnapping. I mean, really, really big events. And then with time, what we found is it started to include some of those chronic trauma experiences. So we would often refer to those as big trauma, really big one-time events that are very acute. But then we started to incorporate our understanding of small t's, or chronic smaller events of trauma. And it started to move outside of a distinct definition. There had to be a life-threatening event. So I'm going to offer a couple of expanded or more up-to-date definitions of trauma. The first and foremost, is too much, too fast, too little, too late. And of course, both at once or in sequence, right? So I want you to think about this in the context of life experiences. Too much, too fast. This is the kind of thing that really incorporates, let's say, if we have a child who is being exposed to themes and experiences that are way above their developmental state. I mean, we know that children are exposed very young to pornography, right? Too much, too fast. Too little, too late can go right directly into the range of something as like physical abuse, right? So there may come a point where after years of neglect or physical abuse, a parent makes, a move forward and creates some progress, but it's already a little too late, too little to be responsive to that child's needs, and it's happening too late. And then a lot of us, frankly, for any number of reasons, are experiencing both of those. So 1 minute feels like it's too much, too fast, and we're overwhelmed beyond our perception of our capacity. And some of us just aren't receiving what we're needing to feel like we're being seen, validated, and heard. Another way to look at trauma is that trauma is getting through something without the experience. So that's big T's, little t's, doesn't matter, but getting through something without the experience being integrated with the body or somatic experiences, the brain, cognitions, or the heart, our affect and our feelings. So if you're anything like me, and I tend to be one of those people that when I'm feeling threatened, stressed, or overwhelmed, I go right up here to my brain. I tend to be a cognitive person. I tend to think. And it's been really helpful. It's gotten me out of a lot of jams, right? And when I do that, it's a coping skill, which, if unchecked, can become an MO. And what I'm getting at is, for many, many, many years, well, I got lots of kudos for being a good problem solver or whatnot, because I was living up here. What wasn't happening was that my brain and my body were not working together. My feelings were often at odds with the thoughts in my head. And that creates, right, a formula or a cocktail that makes it completely easy for things to just tumble down that slippery slope. Because if we set it straight with our brain, but it's outside of our value system, our heart's going to start talking, right? So when we are not having these components of our whole self working together, we are much more likely to experience overwhelming situations as trauma. Another definition: trauma is relative to each person based on existing capacities, the capacity to regulate and integrate following the trauma, and supportive relationships or co-regulation. We're going to talk in depth about each of these things. The point that's most important to make here is that what trauma is for one person is not the same as the trauma for another. That last bullet point, it's not about what happened. It's actually about the impact of what has happened. So it's not the story. It's not the salacious. It's not the aspect of, and then this happened to that person, and then this happened, and then, oh, would you believe it? Then they lost their shoe on top of all of that, or whatever it is. It's really not about that stuff. That's why it's relative to each individual person, right? Because each individual person is already starting with a different internal capacity to respond to the outside world and to make sense of it. And so if somebody's already challenged in that regard for whatever reason, we're not judging that, right? But when that is already challenged, it's not really about what happened that is the trauma. It's not that it was a car accident, or that there was a rape, or that there's alcoholism. It is about the impact of that trauma. My brother and I, raised in the same family, same parents, same socioeconomic class, same schooling, and we are so profoundly different, right? At the very minimum, for instance, he is so much better at externalizing stuff. So he's pretty darn good with his boundaries. He's a great thinker. He's an amazing individual. But when stuff hits him, he can kind of Teflon it out, right? And be like, not my problem. Me, on the other hand, I tend to internalize everything. And so anytime I feel like somebody is upset, hurt, angry, I'm really tuned into that. And then I'm feeling it all myself. And so I might struggle with the boundaries, right? And it's not, again, about what happened, because my brother and I can have the same experience. We could be on the same boat that crashes, and our response to what happened, why it happened, and all of that is going to be totally different, because it's about the impact on us individually. Real quick, be conscious of the fact that there are lots of different types of trauma. I reference big T's and little t's, but I also want you to just kind of hear these, official categories of trauma. So acute trauma, the single big T incident. Chronic trauma is repeated and prolonged. This would include things such as domestic violence, physical or emotional, or sexual abuse. Complex trauma, you've probably heard that referencing, oh, well, if this person is really struggling with some complex trauma. Well, it sure is a word that puts, sort of a heavier impact, but what it really is exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events, often of an invasive interpersonal nature, impacting typical maturation or development. So really the key word there, development. You'll also hear complex trauma referred to as developmental trauma. So in other words, here, somebody born in the world, don't get to choose who we're born to and all of the circumstances that come with that. And then they experience event after event after event, even as they're trying to do the basic developmental pathway, right? Which includes key elements like, who am I? Am I okay? Is the world okay? So when you have traumatic events or experiences punctuating that repetitively, then we're also talking about somebody who not only has experienced those traumatic events, but their very development has been impacted, and their very sense of self, therefore, has been impacted. Another really critical and important component of a category of trauma is referred to as historical trauma. It's multi-generational. It's experienced by specific cultural, racial, ethnic groups. It's related to major events that oppressed a particular group of people because of their status as oppressed, such as slavery, the Holocaust, forced migration, violent colonization of Native Americans. We know history is just chocked full of these things. And it's real. And what we know is that they're actually identifying trauma within the DNA of individuals. And so oftentimes when we talk about trauma being multi-generational, we're getting as concrete as possible in referencing that, because it's literally getting passed on through, birth, right, to the next generation in our DNA. So when you stop and consider a whole group of individuals who have experienced this constantly limiting and oppressive life, we're going to find trauma in that DNA. So it's really critical to bear in mind that sometimes trauma is experienced. Like, again, the impact is different from person to person, but it's even experienced non-directly. So that's a big shift from when it was, you had to have something that was life-threatening, to what we understand now, which is an overwhelm of our perception of our capacity. Any questions so far? Okay, so here's the biggest and I think most profound aspect of understanding trauma today. And whether it's just a trend where we're kind of overlaying a lot of our own individual beliefs or values about how people should handle their lives, that's our stuff, okay? That's the trend of trauma. And that's where, if we sit with that and just leave it there, we have a real potential of developing our own emotional reactivity and inability to kind of come present to somebody who really has struggled with a lot of trauma. And this is a definition. This is the physiological foundation for our understanding of trauma that is really critical. And that is that when you feel super stressed, so as I've mentioned, trauma is really about an overwhelm of our own perception of capacity. I'm going to pause because one of my private clients just this week, and bless her heart, she's a new mom. Her son is less than 3 months old, and she herself has long haulers COVID. And so she's been really struggling with her own medical state and feeling like she has capacity. And she had a rough weekend. Any number of variables popped in, and then the brain kicks in, and she felt that overwhelm to the point where all of a sudden she kind of had an anxiety attack, because she said in her head, I'm not going to be able to do this. I'm not going to be able to care for my infant. I am failing as mom. I'm literally not going to be able to do this. And it literally froze her up, shut her down. proud of her for making an appointment and coming in, and she was able to gain some perspective and recognize that when she got COVID and it literally knocked her out, that was a traumatic shift for her. Now to have made so much progress and go through birth of a preemie with some special medical needs, it is a direct trigger, right? Back to that which she's still working at resolving, which is I do have some management and ability over my capacity. And to be able to learn those skills of how to ground herself in that so that it doesn't sort of recycle the trauma over and over again. So when we're talking about physiological response, what we're talking about is something referred to in the medical field as the stress response. So when you face a real threat or perceived, so this new mom perceived her threat. Is her husband saying she can't do it? Nah. Is her mother-in-law saying she can't do it? Nah. I wasn't saying she couldn't do it. It was her perception. So whether a threat is actually real, concrete, and validated with like observers or third parties, doesn't matter. If we perceive the threat, our system, our body is going to respond as if it's a threat. So your body experiences a collection of changes when this happens, known as your stress response, otherwise known as the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. Most of us have heard of flight and fight. Freeze and fawn have been added in to basically account for what we see and know to be people's experiences when they perceive a threat, real or imagined. Your stress response is a collection of physiological changes that occur when you face a perceived threat that requires more than you have available to successfully cope. So these situations are known as the stressors or the triggers. But what it does is it literally, I'm going to go back, creates a physiological response in the body that you can't turn on or off. And that physiological response is a component of what we call the autonomic nervous system. And we're going to get into that in just a moment. But first, sometimes a video has a great way of putting things. So just to give you the chance to hear this a little differently, we're going to watch this short video.
Life can present stressful situations, like being chased by a man-eating tiger. And when we experience stress, there are symptoms. Maybe we get a headache or a churning stomach. We might snap at our kids or cry more easily. We might think negative or depressing thoughts or get tunnel vision. These symptoms tell us that something is happening in our bodies. What is going on? When there is a perceived danger, our bodies release a surge of hormones, a normal physical response to stress, which helps us prepare to take action. These hormones can cause our heart rate to increase, respiration to increase, blood pressure to rise, blood sugars to rise, digestion to slow down, blood to rush to our muscles. At one time, these responses helped us survive. When being chased by tigers, we needed to be able to fight back or run away. Luckily, nowadays, most of us are not surrounded by those kinds of dangers. The problem is, our bodies still respond as if we are. Our nervous systems aren't very good at knowing the difference between emotional and physical threats. Whether you're stressed over a mountain of bills or a fierce tiger, your body can react in the same way. And the more our stress response is activated, the more easily it gets turned on, and the harder it is to shut off. This is not good. Over time, the increased hormone levels from chronic stress can cause harmful changes to occur in our bodies. These changes can lead to all kinds of bad things like heart disease, sleep problems, digestive problems, depression, obesity, memory problems. It's not a pretty picture, is it? But we don't have to get all stressed out over it. The risks of stress can be offset by learning to handle stress in healthy ways. First, we pay attention to our sources of stress and learn to notice our stress symptoms, physical sensations, thoughts, and feelings. Then we practice simple strategies to interrupt the stress response. Whether our stress comes from major life events or everyday hassles, when we feel stressed, it's for a reason. It's not helpful to blame ourselves or to ignore our stress. What helps is to recognize and accept the feeling, and then take steps to respond in helpful ways.
Okay, so what we're talking about there is this autonomic nervous system response. I'm going to go through a few of these slides pretty quick. Please be sure to write any questions you might have in the chat. But our autonomic nervous system is maybe interchangeable with the term automatic, or what it means is no conscious effort on our part is necessary. This is something that's already programmed into our DNA, and it includes two different responses. So you can think about it this way, where here we are at rest, everything's fine, we had a good breakfast, it seems like the day is going to go okay. In fact, we have a job interview. And that job interview might land us that job that's going to address those bills and get us out, out from being underwater with our house, and or get us into a house or into an apartment, right? And it's feeling like a really good day until we get to the bus stop and it just zooms on by. It doesn't stop, or it never shows up. And something seemingly as silly as missing our bus, all of a sudden in our brain is connected to massive threats in our lives. I literally was just talking to somebody the other day who, had a great plan. He was going to leave an apartment and he had a 3-month house sitting gig. And during that 3 months, he was going to save money to get into a new housing situation. Everything was sequenced, planned, coordinated. And, for whatever reason, the people he was going to house it for canceled last minute. So now what we're talking about is somebody who literally overnight is facing homelessness and is staying in his car. So things happen that are truly perceptively very threatening. And when it does, our body is already designed to kick into gear. And I'm going to explain why. But the first thing it does is it sympathizes with the threat. And that is what we call the sympathetic nervous system response. So everything in our system goes whoop, activated. And then theoretically, once that threat has been resolved and we know we're safe again, then we have a parasympathetic response, or we can rest and recoup again. Okay. This is fundamentally, again, sympathetic and parasympathetic response with our autonomic nervous system. This is just a close-up shot, kind of giving you some scientific meat here. A sympathetic response dilates our eyes. Why? And even if you think in terms of sort of really old school definitions of trauma, you think about being at war, why would our eyes dilate, right? In response to a perceived threat? Well, we got to see it all. Right? Almost like an animal. We got to know what's going on, and we've got to be able to see our surroundings and constantly assess for safety. Whereas when we're in rest and recuperation, we're calming. We know we're safe. We don't need sort of every capacity on alert and active. This is a table that can show you literally, the part of the body on the far left, the structure. And then what happens if our nervous system has been kicked into sympathizing to a threat, believing into a threat, or not? We know we're safe, it's good, it's resolved. So just notice, we're talking not something that's debatable, right? This is not about whether an individual has proper thought patterns, understands cultural differences, Whether this is somebody who, tends to cry all the time and they can never make a decision. Those are the symptoms of being in a trauma state, given the physiology of the body. The eyes dilate or constrict. The heart, you'll have an increased heart rate, or you can feel it like it's going to jump out of your chest, or it's calm. The lungs change. And when you're threatened, dilation goes out, right? And we're like, oh yeah, body, help me breathe here. I just need everything on tap. Think about like if a car, dropped onto somebody or a child. You've heard those stories about how people all of a sudden have superhuman strength and they're just picking up this car. Well, it didn't come from their thought process. This is a physiological reality. We are designed to survive. Okay. So all of these different structures of our body have a direct threat response in order to try and maximize what resources we have available to us for us to survive. So bladder, basically GI or digestive system, will oftentimes be a massive place where we're impacted by trauma. And if you think about somebody who's dealing with chronic trauma and the frequency with which they're dealing with sort of a digestive system upheaval, right? Either constant diarrhea or constipation, or they go to the doctor and they go, oh yeah, you have irritable bowel syndrome, but this is real. And then it's impacting them where they live and their very vessel of being. But it's built in there with the concept of helping us to survive. Just on a side note, it's referencing here, it's referencing penis. But what I want to make sure is clear is that when we think about our sexual social sexual system, what we're talking about is even if we're in a response to threat state or sympathetic, it doesn't mean we can't be present to that or perform, etc. Intensity usually increases, rawness usually increases, and it's not really about intimacy and connection as much, but we can still function on that level, right? So a lot of times people are really shocked by that because we think about our bodies kicking into gear around something as clear cut as a car has fallen, right? But when you are dealing with a situation such as war, right? Or domestic violence, or, really living and wanting to be supportive and loving on somebody who is struggling and facing addictions, right? And feeling, constrained by the addicted brain. This plays into what's happening for us really quickly, because oftentimes trauma is chronic. And so we stop and we don't even consider it trauma anymore. And we start to judge the symptomology of trauma in terms of the decision-making or how that person shows up or whether they're crying all the time. So it's really important to recognize that trauma is something that we can see on a physiological basis with really clear impact on the body and the system as a whole. This is just another slide that kind of helps you see that difference between the stress response and then the rest and recuperation. So on the left, be conscious of the fact, and you might have felt it yourself where we get a whoosh, right? Maybe it's our boss comes and says, hey, I want to talk to you. And just the tone of voice sets us on edge. We're perceiving a threat and bam, we might feel this whoosh. Well, literally, that might be the blood rushing to your skeletal muscles and away from your brain, making it really hard to think clearly. Also, think about it this way. If we're on the battlefield, we don't want to be stopping for potty breaks, right? That's part of the reason why our bodies work the way they do. The challenge is we can't turn this off. And in today's society, with understanding that trauma can hit our physiological and our nervous system, when does it ever end, right? And so what we have to do is learn how to actively and intentionally manage our responses, because all of the things that we're going to do in response to perceived trauma is coming out of the perception that we are not safe. So, for instance, I deal with lower back pain. It's pretty chronic. And at first, it was really scary because it was like, a blown disc or whatever you call it, a bulging disc. And, feeling that, it scared the heck out of me. And so it was like, I don't know what I should do. I don't know if I should move or not move. Oh, but I hear about how back pain is all in the head. And, I'm trying to make sense of this. And here's what I know is when we don't know what the source of pain is, right? Then that pain alert and the physiological stress response is appropriate because the body doesn't know whether it's safe or not. But when we know what the pain is, and hey, it's going to be kind of chronic. What I practice now is as that, like, oh, there goes the back. Oh, and I'm scared. And there's this a threat, right, to my perception of my ability to live life in a capacitated way. Well, that's where I have to stop and pause and say, yes, I feel that pain. No, I don't like it. Yeah, I wish it could go away. And I know that I am fundamentally safe right now. And I literally just talk to my brain. Brain, calm down. Don't need you to go into full on alarm mode right now. Thank you for being willing to take care of me and keep me alive. But right now I need you to relax and let my body relax as well. And the more that we start actively managing this, then it's not a snowball effect, right? Where one aspect of life that can be overwhelming 1 minute snowballs. And it's like the avalanche, and it just starts picking up every other situation in life that is challenging as well. So we can't turn this off, but we can start to manage it. And where we often really need to go with people that we are looking to support or for ourselves, because all of us pretty much have some measure of trauma, is knowing that we're going to feel it most actively based on our memories and our life experiences thus far. And memory is fundamentally lodged in there, documented, based on what we experience repetitively and paired repetitive experience with intense or strong emotions. And that is where a lot of times we create our personal narrative, right? Or our story that just says, yeah, nobody loves me. There must be something about me that's horrible. I'm toxic, and we get into that, and we've felt it before, and it's super intense. We can bring it up in an instant, and we know that icky space. This is where that potential of being stuck in trauma comes into play. So what we're talking about here is how the brain functions. And it's really important to note that the brain develops hierarchically. So when we have a baby in the womb, one of the first areas of the brain to begin to develop is in the brain stem. And that is on this image, the reptilian brain. Okay. And this is all about what do you need first off, most importantly, if you are this helpless little infant, this baby, or even if you just think about the animal kingdom in general, you're new, you're vulnerable, right? So what you need most is a survival instinct. You need the ability to protect oneself to the best of your ability. And so that's the first part of the brain that gets developed. Then it's the limbic system, which typically manages our emotional experiences. And then lastly, our neocortex, often referred to as the wizard brain, up here, the prefrontal cortex. And that doesn't even finish getting developed until we're about 26 years old, right? So this development of the brain starts when we're in the womb and continues until we're 26. And what we're talking about with the stress response is anytime there is that perceived threat, way back down here in the brainstem, we have the amygdala. I'm going to go back up one slide. You can see over here on the far right, the amygdala turns on the fight or flight response, as well as freeze and fawn, and it stores the memories. Okay. So then what we're dealing with is an alarm system in our brain that's going, uh-oh, there's a threat. You better react. uh-oh, there's a threat, you better react. So essentially what it's doing is its job. Its one sole job is to keep us alive, literally keep us alive. But what the amygdala does not care about at all is the quality of that life. So if we are sort of not masters of our nervous system and managing it proactively, then we are going to be victims of our own sort of internal cycles, because the sensitivity gets, up, right? So we're going to be more and more and more reactive. This is why it is so hard, right? To respond to somebody who may be struggling with an active addiction. And so there's already sort of, I'm on the outside of society. My brain isn't even functioning to the degree that I want it to, or that it could, because it's trying to deal with all these other substances. And they're already feeling so bad, most often than not, because you typically aren't engaging in alternative, experiences, unless there's already a little bit of a need to get out of the experience of life you're having thus far. And so here's somebody who's going, all right, I can make myself feel better, right? I'll do this. And then by engaging, right, in certain short-term activities that are meant to create relief, we're actually diminishing our own capacity to do what we're really needing to do with trauma, which is intentionally, consciously managing our own nervous system so that it doesn't have to be in a cycle of reactivity, but it can start to discern that difference between perceived threat, actual threat. And that when we're perceiving the threat, we have that internal capacity to calm ourselves and find safety again. I think we have about 15 more minutes before we're going to take questions and answers. This is just another visual to remind you that the brain develops hierarchically and it functions hierarchically. That means the amygdala or the brainstem, if it perceives the threat, it's going to like push all these other areas of the brain out of the way and be like, get out of the way. No, I'm up. It's my job. I got to keep us alive here right now. And here there's this other part of the brain going, yeah, but maybe we should think it through. Maybe we should, like, I don't know, breathe, right? Calm down and then make some choices or decisions. But that amygdala, it's like the red phone in the president's office. And if that red phone that's like, oh, is ringing constantly, it is so hard to see the logic in taking a breath or trying to manage our somatic reactions, right? To help our brain know, oh, actually, this is a situation I really don't like. I am PO'd. I'm over this. I'm tired of it. We can't even really go there because this part of our brain is going, fight, or run, get away, or you better not move. Like, kind of like the possum in the animal kingdom. Don't move. Don't say the wrong thing. Just get off the radar, right? And that's the freeze response. The fawn response that I've referenced is slightly different, and that comes into play typically as a slightly more sophisticated response to trauma or threats, and that is sort of that desire to please 100-fold, right? So it's sort of this idea of, if I fawn, which means if I do everything in my power to make you feel better, then I'm reducing my perceived threat to my safety. So this is the pleasing instinct 10 times over, right? So I know that was my particular favorite for many, many years. And you'll get really high functioning people who are in a constant state of trauma, fawning their way through life. But when they've learned how to compliment somebody, when they learn how to make you feel good about you, maybe there's a little less focus on our own inadequacies or our shame or our lack of capacity. And it just keeps the trauma cycle going. So when we are providing services or trying to be responsive to people and their amygdala is on fire, And then we are coming at them way up there at the top from the cortical level going, well, what does this really mean to you? And don't you think you should probably try this? We're like missing it. We are just straight up missing it because this is somebody whose brain is going immediate life-threatening issue. They're not going to hear it. Another way to look at it is your 2-year-old, your 3-year-old, the kids. We know, right, that we can't kind of use logic with them. We try. We try to use words to calm them down all the time. But what we usually kind of know by instinct is, man, when that 2-year-old's in a tantrum or that 3-year-old is straight up, angrily drawing on the wall, logic's not going to help in that moment. We've actually got to kind of pull them in, calm them down, and then we can teach, right, what we would like to see from them in the future, because they don't even have this part of their brain developed yet. So it's like amygdala on fire all the time. But we do develop, we do mature, and we can get this a little more under our management. So we're going to test our nervous systems right now. I'm going to show you a very quick video. I want you to notice any physiological changes or body sensations as you watch this short video. So this is different than noticing what your feelings, okay? So feelings are like angry, happy, mad, sad. But when I'm asking you to notice your body sensations, it's things like heart rate, breathing, muscle constriction, temperature, okay? So this cue into yourself. And then if you're already, by the way, really on edge, you might just do well to, take a quick bathroom break and give yourself a break out of this. But this is intended for fun and to give you a chance to just notice what happens in the body. Nice and calm. All right. Does that prove a point? Maybe it's too cheesy. Many of you probably got caught off guard as well. That's kind of how life works, right? So we can be going along. I want you to look at these visuals right now. We might know we're stressed, but we're still able to know we're safe. And so we can enjoy music in our car and maybe not get road rage. We can sometimes with our loved ones who are struggling, just go, you know what? I'm going to let go of the words and I'm just going to reach out and hold your hand. And we can have all of these great moments. And then something comes at us out of the blue. Our amygdala starts reacting. We combine that reaction to any other life experience we've already had, and trauma is off to the races. So here's the key element. It's important to tell our brains, acknowledge that stress. We can say, yes, I am feeling overwhelmed. But at the same time, if it's a stressful time, it's actually really important on a physiological level to say, yeah, I'm stressed out right now and I've got this, right? So if we're not feeding this idea of I can't, it's overwhelming, this is horrible, we're also less likely to get stuck in our trauma response. So really what we're talking about with when does this physiological stress response kick in? It's when we are trying to function outside of our window of tolerance. The window of tolerance is the body in its optimal state. It can be, you can access reason, emotion, you're mentally engaged, you're able to make eye contact. When we are pushed by life circumstances sort of out of our window of tolerance, think again, too much, too fast, or too little, too late, then we can get bumped into either hyperarousal or hypoarousal. And if we are in hyperarousal, it's almost like constant anxiety. Our body has that stress response. We're up there, we're revved, we're hypervigilant, we're ready. We're also very easily irritated. There might be some anger responses. Our digestive system is off, but think hyper, like hyper blood sugars, we go up, right? Hypo, we go down. This is when we go like, I can't, just go without me. I'm going to go back to bed. Our systems are literally shutting down to try to protect us to that overwhelmed state or that threat. The important thing to recognize is that when we are activating the stress response physiologically over time, we literally are opening ourselves to chronic illness, autoimmunity disorders. This is, again, like the video said, when we trigger the stress response, we get adrenaline, we get cortisol, we get all these icky hormones dumping so that we have whatever we need to lift that car up off of that child. Again, if it's truly life-threatening, we want that to kick in, because if I'm in a dark alley in the middle of Denver, like, I want that to kick in and I want to be able to run as fast as I can home, right? But if it's constantly triggered or always triggered, right, it can lead to these stuck states of arousal. So I will have clients come in, and before they even say anything or I know what they've experienced, I can tell you just by observing their bodies and their physiology, whoop, this person is hyper aroused or this person is hypo aroused, right? And oftentimes hyper arousal correlates with anxiety, and hypo arousal will coordinate with depression. And many a person sort of are in a hyper aroused state for as long as they can tolerate it. And then sort of a secondary measure for survival, they literally will shut down. And so it's sort of this anxiety, crash, depression, anxiety, crash. So it can become very cyclical, often will lead to instincts for self-medicating, trying to find relief. Addictions will follow. So this is kind of critical that we become conscious of what's happening on a physiological level in our bodies. I'm going to quickly go through these, but this is a reference point that you can come back to. If you're curious and you are just like, I don't know, well, what is hyperarousal versus being regulated or in a window of tolerance or hypoaroused? These are the slides I would recommend you come back to look for sort of the symptomology. But feelings of panic, anxiety, insomnia, reduced tolerance for pain, difficulty concentrating, this is all hyperarousal. Hypoarousal, lethargic, dulled capacity to feel, because it's just too hard, emotional constriction. When I work with teenagers, this is the telltale sign that they're probably in a hypoaroused space. I'll say, well, what do you think about that? Or how do you feel about that? Or, the traditional therapist line, and they're, I don't know. That's hypoarousal right there, right? Tired, inability to set boundaries, feeling helpless. Regulated, we have a big range of emotions, but fundamentally it's our body, we own it, we feel like we can do stuff with it. We're able to make eye contact, we're able to make social contact. This is us in our window of tolerance. So I am also going to quickly show you some pictures, because I want you to see if you can notice even some subtle changes in your own nervous system, because this is the kind of stuff we can listen to and we can easily be like, oh my gosh, this is a bunch of malarkey. But if we pay attention, we start to realize, oh my gosh, this is real. And I'm living it every day myself, let alone my clients or those who I'm loving on and trying to support, right? So I'm going to show you a picture. I'm going to wait just a few seconds. I want you to notice the impact of that picture on your body. What sensations do you notice? Oof. Just from those two pictures, do you notice for myself, at the first one, I felt relaxed, smile on my face, like, aw. And this one, like, I also have an awe, but after constriction, my heart rate picks up a little bit. I'm like, oh my gosh, something's really not okay here, right? Even just remembering the feeling of sun on your face, right? That can even calm our nervous system a little bit in the moment. Love this picture. When you think about all the people you interact with, sometimes it's kind of hard to know what we're seeing. You know, is it boredom? Is it loneliness? Is it curiosity and timidness? I just got a jolt of energy seeing this little girl's face. A little uplift of the heart. So given this background and definition of trauma as a physiological response, I want you to start noticing, first and foremost for yourself, but for others that you are interacting with. Notice when you have somebody who is acting out, behaving aggressively, even overly silly, or exhibiting defiance, like, yeah, that's what you think, right? I don't know how many times I've heard, that's your opinion, you know, those kind of comments, being hyperactive, arguing, maybe somebody who automatically or instinctively may clench their fists. Pause for a second and consider this person may be in a trauma response state of fight, that they're perceiving some threat, whether it's logical or not, and their body is taking over and sort of hijacking any conscious thought they might be trying to have. The key there is in any of these responses, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So when I have clients who start gushing, oh, you've made such a difference in my life. Oh, you know, at first it's really tempting because I'm like, ah, what a nice ego moment. And then I think, oh my gosh, is this fawning? Because if it's fawning, there may have been an unconscious trigger and they're actually saying all this lovely, wonderful stuff, but out of a trauma response because they're trying to keep themselves safe. This is sort of a rubric for you to pause and reevaluate what you're seeing in people's bodies without judging the decision making, without judging them as a person, because this is something we're all programmed to do. And so flight can look like daydreaming. Flight can look like hiding. Flight can be like wiggly feet. You ever talk with somebody and they're just with their feet the whole time? There's something happening for them in their autonomic nervous system. And those wiggly feet are kind of like, can I go now? Can I go? Because I'm still feeling the need to do something to keep myself safe. Freezing, man, it's just the pure shutdown, literally frozen or paralyzed. So when we are working with folks or when we're trying to support folks or our own selves with trauma, here's the key. The goal is to widen our windows of tolerance. It is not to eliminate the stress of the trauma. That's unachievable. It's impossible, nor can we actually turn our stress response off. So we are actually much more efficient and best serving of others and self if what we're learning to do is to manage our physiology response to trauma, whether it be chronic, acute, historical, or otherwise. So responding positively and learning to manage our own stress responses means learning what our triggers are, addressing them, starting to learn our bodies and track them, avoiding them, mitigating them, befriending them as needed. How do we widen our window of tolerance then? We do this by consciously tracking ourselves. A lot of times, one of the first things I will do, I have TMJ. Does anybody else have jaw popping issues or clenched jaw? That's an unconscious thing that my body does in response to stress. So a lot of times I'll just, oh, it's really tight here. Now, when I first started this work, what I wanted to do is say, oh, it's really tight here, and that's bad. But what's really important is not to add in a judgment to awareness of our body. Simply knowing what our body is doing allows us to go, huh, I think I'm kind of hyper aroused right now, or I think I might be a little hypo aroused, because then we can figure out next best steps. What does my body need? Oh, if it's hyper aroused, maybe it needs some release or some safe calming. If I'm hypo aroused, maybe I need to, get some empathy and a hug and just know I'm safe right here in this moment right now. It's when we can pause on that stress response that we can use this part of our brain again. And when we can use this part of our brain again is when we can make better decisions, or when we can engage in self-care. Otherwise, it's really hard. So remind ourselves, we've got this. And remember, literally tell your brain, if you're safe, look around. Am I safe? Is there anybody here right now? No, I'm nervous as heck. I'm talking to a bunch of people on the computer, but I'm safe. And that helps my brain go, oh, okay, false alarm. Don't call the president's office. We're good, right? Just stress. Another way to look at it, all symptoms of dysregulation arise out of misperceptions of the events in our lives. When we change our perceptions, we change the symptoms in our nervous system. It is wise, therefore, to master the art of how to change our perceptions and how to manage the symptoms that arise in our bodies to help return us to a more regulated state. There's a bunch of other information here, but I'm going to pause because we're kind of in this last half hour and I want to make sure there's plenty of time for questions and answers. Do we have questions, Jessica?
There is nothing in the chat yet, but
Okay.
feel free to post your question in the chat. You can unmute yourself, and we'll be monitoring that too.
Great. I'm going to give a couple minutes for that to kind of start up or come in, and reference this slide in the meantime. And that is the idea of state dependence. I've talked about the brain developing hierarchically, functioning hierarchically. The developing brain organizes in response to the pattern, intensity, and nature of sensory and affective experiences. Basically, the brain is constantly trying to respond to whatever we go through in life. But here's the point. If we are dysregulated or we perceive a threat, then what we have to understand is the sequence of engagement that is most effective in helping us calm our brain again and understand that we are safe. If we don't understand this sequence of engagement, then we may be trying to reason, right, with somebody who is feeling like they're under active threat. Have you ever called the customer service line with your cell phone carrier and something horrible happened on your end that had all kinds of impacts, and you're calling them and you're like, you wouldn't believe this just happened. And then you get that person who uses that syrupy, sweet tone of voice and, oh, this is really important to us. So here's what we need to do. And then you just know they're reading from a screen. They're not hearing you. They're not really getting what you're going through. That's what it's like when we're dysregulated or feeling threatened and we're in a stress response. And then here comes somebody trying to reason or use, stuff up at this level. No, it doesn't work. We absolutely have to help somebody experience safety first. Are you safe in this moment? Can we regulate our breathing? Can we calm our bodies so that it's not constantly getting this message that it needs to dump all these hormones that just freak us out and take over? Then once we've done safety, connect with that person, right? engage with that person, remind that person of their validity, of their importance, of what they've accomplished, no matter how small it is. And then once we've established that, and you can tell that this person is back in their body, maybe their eyes are no longer dilated, maybe you can just see in their body that there's just a little more relaxation to their physical structure. That's when you can challenge. That's when you say, hey, what does your wizard brain really want next, right? And then you can do your treatment planning. Then you can do your goal planning. But man, if we say, hey, you got to come in today, sit down, and we're going to ask you all these questions about all the ways that your life has been really messed up. And then we're going to create a plan on how we're going to fix it all. And we're completely clueless of whether that person is in a stress response state. We're going to miss the bullet. I mean, we're just going to miss it. And then that is when we often will say this person doesn't care about their own treatment, or it's a difficult client, or, you know, and we start externalizing it and or personalizing it. And so this is just that reminder, our brains function hierarchically. Start with safety. Help this person identify whether they are safe or not. Help this other person or yourself be reminded of our goodness, no matter how big or small that is. And then we can challenge ourselves for growth.
Tamra, we do have an anonymous question in the chat.
Right?
How do neurodiverse people distinguish stress response from a daily response? For example, flight looks like daily life with ADHD.
Flight looks like daily life with ADHD. Yeah. I mean, so neurodiverse individuals are also basically struggling with this. And that's a big piece of this movement, right? Is to say, when we already understand that there are components of our brain functioning that may not be picking up on certain things. I'm not going to reference ADHD, but even if we look at the autism spectrum, and we look at an individual with Asperger's, there is a neurodivergency in the sense that this is an individual who may not be picking up on the social cues as much. It would be really hard. It would be a real challenge for that individual, for instance, to be a case manager trying to support individuals with trauma, because so much of that is going to get missed, right? I'm not sure if I am getting the crux of the question, though. Essentially, neurodiversity is going to offer additional challenges for that individual in a similar fashion to adverse childhood events or ACEs for another individual. I'm not sure. Can you reread the question, Jessica?
Absolutely. So how do neurodiverse people distinguish stress response from a daily response? For example, flight looks like daily life with ADHD.
Yeah. And again, I guess I'm going to first come back and just say, I think that's going to be best answered when you are relating to a specific individual, because it's not just, neurodivergency, all respond like this versus not. And so what we're talking about is being able to identify trauma as a physiological reality. So someone who is neurodiverse may be perceiving a threat that isn't there, but they also may be missing a lot of threats that everybody else is picking up on, if this is making sense. So I'm not going to be able to get in there and say, here is specifically how it's perceived differently, because each person is fundamentally really different in their capacity to do that and how they were raised or nurtured. So I don't know if I'm answering that question very well, but that's my offer.
We do have one more, Tamra.
Sure.
Do you have any suggestions for proactive strategies to help people feel safer in the workplace?
Yes, absolutely. So I think, first of all, at work, if we are not trying to function from a trauma-informed perspective that is based not on the traumatic event, but that is helping all staff understand and experience the promotion of self-regulation, the ability to recognize that we're all individually responsible for learning some of those skills in terms of how to regulate ourselves and calm ourselves. But if we're in a workplace, we can do that, either A, top down, trying to get administration trained so that they understand and recognize that it's not that, oh, 5 more policies or protocols are going to solve for these issues that are coming out of a heightened awareness of our emotional states, but no tools to manage them. But to really get in there and help people learn skills such as nonviolent communication would be a great skill, I think, to help promote a trauma-informed approach at work. Allowing people to start referencing and acknowledging, yeah, I'm here at the meeting today, but I got to tell you, I'm kind of in a red zone right now, right? We've learned to do check-ins, but using something, I'm going to reference something called the zones of regulation. Some of you may have heard of it, but it's kind of a color-coded way of recognizing, am I in a hyper-aroused state? Am I hypo-aroused? Am I like, whoop, I'm ready to blow, I'm in red, or am I green? I'm ready to go, I'm regulated, I'm ready to learn, I'm ready to connect. But to acknowledge that this is the reality that all of us are needing to learn more skills about to be able to manage for ourselves so that we're not just tapping out every other day. With our colleagues, we can just simply ask, how are you doing? Notice, are they talking to you with clenched fists? Notice their physiology. Help them understand it's not a personal thing. Talking about trauma, not as something that is a moral deficit, right? Like those are all critical elements of being able to be more supportive of one another at work. And I'll tell you, even when you think about it, what we're describing here is the individuals who have experienced trauma and are dysregulated in their system. One individual is going to bump up against another individual who's got that same state. And so what are the odds that we're gonna, have reactivity and conflict? They're pretty high. And so a big piece of it is, I think, in the workplace, recognizing and starting to develop policies that acknowledge our individual needs are not in competition with one another. I need affirmation. This other person needs space. It's not that the needs themselves are directly in competition with each other. It's the strategies that we're going to individually choose to try to meet our need is where the conflict can actually arise. So the more that we can learn these components and say, I know I need affirmation, and here my direct coworker is somebody who feels manipulated with words of affirmation and wants space, right? Well, we're going to have to figure out some sort of a compromise, right? But recognizing that a lot of that is actually in our DNA, it's physiologically programmed. It's what we're doing, not because the other person is, quote, stupid or, a jerk or something like that. This is what we do to try to keep surviving with as much quality of life as we can. So getting into a mindset that says, look, it's not a pie, there's not only 8 slices. And if we don't, get a slice, we're completely screwed, right? It's as a place of employment or with our coworkers, being able to learn the language for ourselves, practicing it ourselves to regulate, and then being conscious of the fact that the other person is needing to probably do the same thing. So for instance, my dad is a big trigger for me. I'll just give that example. And just that basic sense of no matter what I would say or do, it was never good enough, et cetera, et cetera. He always had more advice or more corrections or more criticisms or something like that. And for years that created power struggles and conflicts. And, I'm learning some of this new stuff. And so finally one day I was like, you know what? Hey, Dad, you're saying all that, right? Which of course I want to label as gobbledygook and mean. You're saying all of that because you you really want me to have every resource available to me, right? Your intention is that I'm conscious of all the things that I might not have seen because you just want me to be really informed. Is that accurate? Is that your intention right now? And as soon as I spend that little extra time validating his intention, which is actually to love deeply and generously, he calms. He calms immediately. And when he calms, guess what happens for me? I calm. I'm like, oh, he just really wants me to have everything I need. Then I can take ownership for my own stuff and I can regulate myself out and I can say, hey, Dad, I really appreciate your intention. The impact is landing differently. I think it might be best for us not to keep talking about it, but I so appreciate that you love me and you are willing. And it's a polite way of kind of going, yeah, my needs are not getting met here, right? So more we learn how to track ourselves and regulate ourselves, the more adept we are at being able to come alongside somebody else and co-regulate and help them find calm as well. Pause there.
We don't have any more questions in the chat right now, but feel free to keep them coming or unmute yourself.
I was wondering, like, how this seems like from an individual perspective, how would you, I guess you talked about it earlier with proactive strategies for safer, how would you apply some of this principles to like an organizational, like behavioral psychology, like kind of a larger scope?
Absolutely. Yeah. So not sure. There's so much we're not actually covering technically. So I want you to always feel free to go back and kind of look through some of these things. But I have worked with probably 3 different organizations to help them become trauma informed, right? So when we do this process, I mean, first of all, it's really critical to make sure that people are actually trained and understand what trauma is, not just from a trendy point of view or how people reference it. Another is to start helping an organization recognize and review sort of policies and protocols. If we're an agency that's saying we're trying to be trauma informed, and yet we do things like create an absolute universal expectation for all consumers, clients, guests, however we want to reference that. Like I am thinking about our traditional intake practices, right? So we set an appointment, we have somebody come in, and it's all about getting the information. And yet from a trauma-informed perspective, what we're really trying to do is create increased safety so that that person can maximize the best version of self as much as possible. So when we do things like, tell me this, tell me that, tell me this, tell me that, did this happen? We're literally asking somebody in a concise, timed way to review everything bad that may have ever happened in their life. How do you feel? So when we're actually working to be trauma informed as an agency and we're applying a little more broadly what we're talking about here thus far on a more individual basis, it's actually not too difficult to see lots of area for adaptation. It is effectively a massive paradigm shift, especially for social service agencies, right? We have said, I think probably for about the last 20 years, relationship first. But when our agencies create a protocol or an expectation that disallows for the building of connection and relationship, we're at odds, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that's answering your question.
No, I think it is, because I feel like a lot of things, there's dissonance of practicing what you preach, especially from an organizational level. And what you said earlier, we put a lot of the onus on survivors to, which is, I think that's not, I don't know if that's necessarily fair, but we do a lot of, like, I've noticed from several organizations putting the onus on survivors, like you said, asking this and this and this, and expecting them to have this quick processing of everything that's happened. Or I think of like crisis management or intervention from like a professional level too. It's like, how do we improve those processes? Because I feel like they're the same kind of dated processes that's always existed with that. But I think that was great.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and absolutely. And fundamentally, like for an agency, I mean, oftentimes what we're talking about is an agency has to get together, do that dialogue enough to say, what are our primary values if we're going to be trauma informed? Those values. So things like transparency or recognizing historical trauma or things along those lines, they become a checks and balances, kind of like in our government theoretically, right? So when a new policy is being designed or when there is a practice that is under review, when you know your value set or your guiding principles, and there's a few different versions out there, it just kind of depends on what speaks best to any given agency, you can kind of check back and say, okay, I'm going to use an example of a group that I worked with for developmental disabilities. So their consumers were primarily struggling with cognitive disabilities, intellectual disabilities, some physical disabilities, but things where in their day respite program or their day treatment program, say an individual, quote, starts acting out. They use their electric wheelchair to turn their back to the group. Their arms cross over and they pout and they stick out their tongue and they're, all of this is going on in the behavior. And then thus far, how this agency had been really trained was to respond behaviorally.
Yeah, I have a background in special ed and I always feel like we don't take into account, we always think of operant conditioning and not the classic conditioning from trauma, because, with that, you would take it as most procedures, we do planned ignoring or redirection, but you never do planned ignoring for someone that's experienced neglect, like, and stuff like that. And so I think most professionals don't have trauma-informed care. They have the basic understanding of that. So that's such a great, that's really interesting.
And so like another big debate out there, ABA, can you have a trauma-informed perspective and be ABA? Absolutely. I would refer you back and say, look at Bruce Perry's sequence of intervention based on how the brain functions. So again, like you're making a reference to planned ignores, how insensitive would be a planned ignorer for somebody who their primary trauma that they're carrying is complete neglect, right?
Yeah.
And yet, if we build in some understanding around these clinical features of trauma, attachment style comes into play. And so as much as there's a trauma response with somebody walking away, ignoring, abandoning, if you've already lived neglect, this is an individual who technically also might be avoidant in their attachment style because you can't trust anybody. And to have intimacy isn't safe either. And so you're constantly trying to go, wait, should I do a planned ignore? Wait, maybe they need some space because there's attachment stuff that's up and out and too much is too much for them. And that's why I guess what I'm suggesting here is get educated about these physiological responses and then recognize that each person is individual in that. If we looked at our roles a lot more as, hey, I'm going to be a guardian of your nervous system along with you. I'm going to partner with you to help you learn how to manage this differently. We've dropped so much that often comes across as judgmental, right? Or setting up goals for a treatment plan that don't even match where this individual is at or what they're needing, if that makes sense. And so in some ways it's more complicated. And I also kind of want to say, hey, but when we come back and we recognize this from a physiological standpoint, it gives us a chance to really sit down and review our current practices. Why are we doing that? And that's all that is frequently needed. If there is truly an openness to sit down and kind of go, well, why do we assume that if a client gets belligerent in the office that we should discharge them? I'm trying to think of language in agencies in the past. Well, why is that a practice at this agency? Is that to protect ourselves? Is that because they need to understand the proper boundaries? Might it be an opportunity to not react to this other person's trauma, to help them go, oh, yeah, okay, maybe I don't have to be constantly on the defense here, right? And then there's potentially some more safety being experienced, and you get a different person, not a
Yeah.
stress response person, right?
Totally. Oh, well, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Kimber, we do have one more question in the chat.
great.
Do you have language to let others know an action they are doing is triggering a trauma response for education and self-advocacy?
Yeah, absolutely. What a great question. So I mean, what I quickly put in my head there is how many different times that can happen. So maybe you're a coworker and you're watching somebody do something out of the best of intentions, but you're watching the impact on a given guest or individual, and you're going, whoa, you're seriously triggering them. I have an example. I used to work in Head Start. And there was one of the school managers, for instance. She was literally, I think, over 6 foot and almost 300 pounds. And she would get called in when these little 3 to 5 year olds were acting out and they couldn't get calmed down. And so what would happen is she'd walk in and she had this booming voice. What's wrong here? What's going on? And I would just watch that child go, nothing, everything's fine. And the teachers and this director of the school's impression was, she was an ace at helping kids calm down. Is that what you're hearing? I mean, I think she was an ace at being amazingly intimidating. So they've got the kid into shutdown and they went frozen. I'm like, yep, I'm done. So I think I'm not losing track of the question, but the language I think would always come back to being able to use I feel statements. So we're not making accusations about anybody else's intentions. We can own our own impact and keep that separate from assigning intention to somebody else. So I can say to my partner, for instance, there's time where, we might be sitting on the couch and watching TV and hours can go by without any eye contact or touch or language. And I just want you to be aware, like, that I have found really triggering for myself, because my brain starts telling me I've done something wrong, and I'm not worthy of your attention anymore, right? I'm owning it. It's my experience. I'm not needing to judge the fact that that's what happens, right? So I can bring that up in a self-advocacy way. Does not guarantee that he's going to go, oh, okay, I'm never gonna not look at you again. I'm just gonna constantly look at you. That's not realistic. No, but I can name my own trigger, and I'm naming what I would ideally like, right? So I'm responsible for managing my own trigger. He's not. So I might say as a follow-up, I'd like to, when I start feeling that trigger response and my brain is starting to go into these other directions of what does this mean? If I reach out and touch you, would it be possible just to get that really quick tap in connection and acknowledgement? Because that will help my nervous system calm back down. So I don't know if that's helpful, but you think even about bosses, right? And there's a job at hand, there's a task that has to be done. We don't always take the time to use, perfect language. And that's life. I mean, we're never going to have people around us who will always do that. And so recognizing your own response is really the critical first step. If we're not even conscious of our own nervous system response, maybe because you're like me and you live up here in your brain and you don't even notice that your heart is racing. The very first time I became conscious of any kind of body response was when I was teaching anger management to middle schoolers. And I was having them identify, where does the anger show up in their body? And here all of a sudden I realized, oh my goodness, I have a little bit of an issue with authority. And almost any time I was talking to somebody in a position of authority, my toes and my shoes were completely curled up, crunched, painfully tight and constricted. That's a trauma response. Right? That's my body going, freeze, get off the radar. right? Or hold the fight back, or whatever it may be. So first and foremost, we have to be knowledgeable about our own responses, how that works. And then it's much easier to use that self-advocating language and name it. And it doesn't have to be named with apology. It doesn't have to be named with judgment. This is what's happening for me. It would be really awesome if you were willing to blank. And if not, then here's what I will need to do on my own behalf to keep myself in as regulated of a state as possible. Does that answer? Get me going.
Yes, it looks like that answered the question, Tamara. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, and if questions do come up, if you think of something once we hop off, the last slide that we have will show contact information for all of us and also for Tamara as well. So you'll be able to reach out to her if you have any additional questions. And Margie did post a link to a survey in the chat that we would love if you could fill out for us. It should take less than 5 minutes. And then Tamara, go ahead and take the floor. I didn't mean to take the floor over.
No, you're great. That was the same thing. So my guess is Margie's got it covered. I just wanted to make sure what would be really helpful, I think for Witchy, for myself, what more do you want? What information would be really helpful? There's so much out there right now. It's kind of hard to filter it in to find just the right topics. But with that idea of if there were future opportunities for additional trainings, what do you want to know more about? That would be awesome if you want to throw that into chat or send me an email later. I also, by the way, just at the very, very end, today I've modeled a guided meditation for creating a safe place visually, in a visualization mode. That's something you could practice for self and with clients or loved ones. And the last slide with the contact information is up. And so feedback is completely welcomed. I feel like we only hit about half of all this, but really anything more you're looking for, any further questions, I love to engage with folks. Feel free to email me anytime. Thank you.